Good day, class, and welcome back to Digital Media Convergence 2 with Boston Media House. Okay, so today we're looking at lesson 21. It is titled Digital Tools Available for Radio Content Creation, Distribution, and Consumption. Okay, so this is a two-part lecture in this lesson, lesson 21. We'll be covering the first part, and then the next lesson we'll be covering part 2. All right, so let's. Okay, so a quick recap from last week. We did lesson 21, 19 and 20, and this week we're moving on to 21 and 22. So recap of lesson 20, we looked to develop a critical understanding of the various television/video tools and platforms, when to use which tool/platform, and how to best use each tool/platform. Similar to the week before, where we did this focusing on website building and social media. All right, and then the second recap is we looked to develop an understanding on what to keep in mind when distributing your video content, either on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. So your video content won't really be on LinkedIn unless it's informative and it applies to your professional branding, but if it's for just general content creation, you wouldn't necessarily put it on LinkedIn, but it's still very important to keep that in mind because these are very different platforms which can serve you in very different ways. All right. Okay, so the objectives for lesson 21. We will critically evaluate various digital tools available for radio content creation, distribution, and consumption. Okay, guys, so keep in mind, remember, we have two types of radio. We have radio on the FM and we have radio online. Okay, and then we're going to understand the importance of planning and professionalism when conducting an interview. Very important. You guys will be conducting an interview for your assignments, so please keep that in mind. And then understand and evaluate the practical application of various podcast distribution platforms. All right, so we do obviously have our preferred ones, which we have included and discussed with you guys, but as stated in your brief, you're more than welcome to use other platforms and tools, anything of your choice, but we have recommended some simple ones which are super easy to use. All right, let's move straight into the lesson. So the first thing we're going to look at is why you should have a podcast. So looking at the basics of it with modern marketing challenges, the first one is standing out from the noise. So the noise is obviously the crowded area. And the second one is converting leads into money. All right, so first of all, we need to stand out. Once we've stood out, we can get leads, but then we need to move to converting it into money, meaning income, sponsorships, etc. Okay, so podcasting creates a platform where you can differentiate yourself from others. So that's quite important. That deals with the first issue of standing out from the noise. Here you have the opportunity to differentiate yourself from everyone else. It also creates an opportunity to communicate your personality and values informally. All right, so that's quite important because usually podcast is a little bit of a discussion, even when it is academic or educational, anything like that. It is quite informal. So here you can express who you are. They can hear, your dry humor, for example, if you have a dry humor like myself. And they can hear that on the podcast, whereas on other platforms, it's quite difficult to gain that insight into someone, even if you're looking at captions and things like that. Again, it's difficult to get sarcasm and things like that off of a written word. So podcast is a nice way to communicate in that aspect. All right, and then in a podcast, your brand's uniqueness can show and you can build your audience base. So that's very important for podcasts is branding. Branding your podcast to align with social media, your topic, etc. And this is where it can really shine. Okay, and then obviously to build your audience base, it's where it's applicable. So if you are doing, for example, you have an Instagram page that's based around, looking fashionable on a budget, student budgets, but you still want to look good, and then you create a podcast based about this, and you talk to other people that have come up in fashion or anything like that, you are then going to draw a certain audience base because of the uniqueness of your page and the podcast and everything. Okay, and then your listeners could eventually become your brand advocate. So there are certain podcasts that people just love and adore, and they recommend it to everyone and anyone that they speak to. And that is the kind of audience that you want, where it's almost free advertising. They actually enjoy your content so much, They are advertising for you. All right. So it's like the same as wearing a branded shirt. You love that brand so much, you're happy to wear the logo across your chest, and when people ask you where you got it, you tell them. All right. Similar thing. Yeah. Moving on to the next slide, but this is a continuation of our first point. So it's important to have these aspects, and your podcast can be successful as long as you offer value in more than one of the following. So knowledge, information, hacks, escapism, and an alternative view. All right, so those are a few key areas in podcasting, which is quite enjoyable. And you kind of need to look at what it is that you're offering and see, does it fall in any of these? Is it a combination of them? That kind of thing. So that's a really nice little list to just kind of help gauge what are you actually trying to sell on your podcast? What is the hook? All right. Moving into 1.1, we're looking at types of podcasts. Obviously, there are different types of podcasts. I have mentioned a few over here, so you can definitely go and search them. Obviously, we all know Joe Rogan. I'm sure that's the first one you all saw. He is an interview style. Okay, let me quickly read the description for you. So there are many types of podcast formats, and it's advised that you listen to a couple of them before embarking on your podcasting journey. Okay, so that's very important. A lot of people are quick to say, they want to maybe be like Joe Rogan and they go into an interview style, but they don't realize that their topic doesn't necessarily allow them to do an interview style, for example, that kind of thing. Okay, so the first one is the interview style. Then we get the panel discussions. This is where you will have more than two people, and they will each give their own discussion. They'll kind of be like a general topic for the day set, and they will all give their 2 cents and discuss it with one another. Very much like a talk show where there's more than one host, that kind of thing. And then moving on to educational, obviously there are many educational podcasts, be it on very niche topics or just general health, fitness, maybe environmental hacks, that kind of thing. Then you get industry specific. Okay, so that's quite interesting. Let's say you're an investment banker. I promise you there are podcasts about investments and banking, and it is perfect for that investment banker that just wants to listen about things that he works with. Okay. And then you get produced narratives. Okay, produced narratives. Malcolm, this one that I've put over here, is extremely interesting. So it's very much looking at history on certain issues, and they then discuss on that. All right, 1.2 is recording your podcast. So you kind of decided what you want to do. You kind of decided what style you want to go for, what your topic's going to be. And now we're going to look into recording your podcast. Guys, later on we do discuss this a little bit further, and we will actually start doing an activity. Okay. So to record, edit, and distribute your podcast, you will need hardware and software, but technically all you need to create a podcast is a phone. The reason being is because you can have the hardware and software on a single cell phone, which is great. But obviously there are some people who'd like for us to go further into the explanation. So here are some of the items you may need. So again, microphones, you can just use your mobile phone. The software that can then come with whatever software you've chosen to download. So there is the Adobe Suite, but that is quite costly, and it can be a little bit tricky to navigate for starters. All right, so what we do suggest, and we've also suggested this with you guys in the past, is to use Audacity. Okay, Audacity is great for editing podcasts. And then we're going to look at the environment. So the environment is something that a lot of podcasters don't necessarily take into consideration, but you need a quiet space to record your audio. The enemy of audio recording is flat surfaces off which sound can bounce. All right, so obviously if you're using your phone, you don't really want to hold it the whole time. What you can do is place it on a pillow or a cushion so that it can absorb that sound, the vibration, all the extra harsh, frequencies. It can just kind of absorb all of that. So that's a nice little tip. Or a towel, even just fold a towel a few times, that kind of thing. Just make sure that it isn't muffled. For example, if you use a pillow, make sure that it doesn't muffle the sound. All right. Then looking at editing your podcast. All right. With a bit of time, you'll be able to edit music into your podcast, record intros and outros, and present a comfortable audio experience to your audience. Okay. For help on editing your audio, check out the Audacity tutorials. Guys, these are super helpful. I would highly suggest going to Audacity tutorials and checking it all out. Also give you a nice idea as to what all the features are that they have on them. And then when we look at putting music into things or anything like that, the first thing we need to think about is, am I allowed to do this? Okay, so looking at copyright laws. Okay, so remember, copyright applies, and you will have to use royalty-free music if you would like to produce content that will pass the checks. Okay, so if you've ever posted anything on YouTube, you know that it goes through a whole bunch of checks to ensure that you aren't using anything that you're technically not allowed to use. All right, without paying for it or subscribing with it or anything like that. Okay, so on the next slide we have a nice little list. So here's a list of references where you can find music to use in your podcast. Okay, guys, definitely go and check all of these out. Some even are a little bit more themed. So here's classical music tracks from Muso Pen. Okay, definitely go and look at these. A lot of the time, the websites that you use to record and edit your podcasts will have a preset list, kind of like Instagram. You know, when it says that the music isn't available in your area, it's kind of like because we don't have the rights to that as a royalty-free product. Okay, so that's a good way of going about it. Just go and check all of these out. Okay, 1.4 is distribution of your podcast. So obviously, for argument's sake, you've created it, you've recorded it, and now what will you do? Okay, your podcast will require a podcast host. So it's like a website. And here are a few options. We have Buzzsprout, Simplecast, and then Anchor. I have previously used Anchor, and it is super, super user-friendly. You can actually even use it to record and edit your podcast, but it does have somewhat basic functions in comparison to Audacity. Okay, and moving on to 1.5, launching your podcast. Okay, here we're going to look at what's important. So the virality of any content is a factor of the value it offers to the audience, not the brand it represents. Okay, so with podcasts or anything like that, we actually want to know, what are we gaining out of this? What's the value out of this? You could be a celebrity, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your podcast will be successful, that kind of thing. All right. So here's how you can accelerate the velocity of the uptake in your podcast. So first is to start with your friends and family. Ask them to listen to your podcast and give feedback on the content. You want honest feedback. You want them to tell them what I liked, what I didn't like, that kind of thing. Okay. It's also a good way to start getting it out there, start distributing it. B is create a lot of hooks. Prep images and brand elements that you can recycle for future episodes, aligned with who you are and how you want to be perceived. Branding is the promise of what you'll offer your audience. Okay, so again, as I said with podcast, branding is important. But again, just because you're a celebrity does not necessarily mean that your podcast will be successful. So there's a fine line between your existing brand and branding yourself on podcasting. Okay, here we're focusing on branding yourself on podcasting. It is extremely important, and usually you would like to start create a little recording bank where you have ideas, maybe a few interviews or anything like that already done and dusted, so that you can publish them at any point. Maybe you get super busy one week and you're unable to publish anything, and you usually publish on a Wednesday, then you can just kind of recycle that. All right. And then C is make it as easy as possible for people to listen to your podcast. Okay, this is very important. You want accessibility. You don't really want to have to now go and search and then their name's written all funny or anything like that. So to avoid link overkills, because obviously, I mean, they were like, well, then just send me the link. Great. But then there's 30 links. Okay, then there's one for Anchor, Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, any other platform that you can think of. Okay, then you kind of like, oh, now I need to go and click on them, see, okay, do I have the app? Don't, you know, that kind of thing. Rather just use this website that we've linked over here, and that will then help you with link overkill. Okay, so it groups all the platforms into one link for users to select their preferred platform. All right, so I don't have to go and search through all your links. I'll click on that link, it'll say which platform do I want to use, and I'll say, well, I know I have that platform, and I will click on it. Okay. All right, moving on to 1.7, what's on the horizon? So what's in the future for this? So this is quite interesting. In a big move, Facebook has recently announced that they are rolling out podcasts on Facebook. I feel like it was only a matter of time before Facebook started looking how they can integrate podcasts. They are quite forward thinkers and they generally get to the punch first. So it was only a matter of time. So Facebook will allow the sharing of 1 minute segments with friends as well as the option to comment on the timeline, just like how you can with SoundCloud. Okay, so any of you that use SoundCloud, you know exactly what it is that they're talking about. So that is going to be quite an interesting thing where you can share the 1 minute segment especially. Okay, now we're going to look at 9 key tips for conducting better podcast interviews. That is going to be very interesting because, again, for your guys' assignment, you are conducting an interview. So please, please, please take note of what I'm going to tell you. All right. I have linked all the references for all the stuff that I'm discussing at the end of the lesson. So if you feel like I didn't go into enough depth or anything like that, or you want to read the full article, please go and click on the references that I've placed at the bottom of the lesson. But right now we're going to look at the 9 key tips for conducting better podcast interviews. The first one is find guests you're really interested in. Okay, so don't just interview someone because they're famous. It will come across as ingenuine on your podcast. Your audience will hear that you're not really that interested or that you're not actually that informed on that guest because again you're not really that interested in them, and your audience will definitely pick up on that. Okay, so don't just interview someone because they're well known or famous. Interview them because you're actually genuinely interested in them. Okay, then number 2 is do some research on your guest. So this is quite important, just like going for any interview, job, or with a person. You want to do your research on the people that you're speaking to. So here are some basic sites, the things that you should check out before you sit down with your guest to start recording. So read their about page. So if they have a website or an autobiography online or anything like that, definitely go and read about it, see who they are, what they're about, where they see themselves going. Check out their social media profiles. That can be quite interesting, especially because they can start posting things on Twitter. Maybe they've shared an article about an interesting topic, and then you can talk to them about that and say, we see that you're discussing this or that, or you're raising money, you're into charity, whatever the situation is. That's quite important. Then you can find out media appearances that they've already done. Okay, so that's quite interesting, especially with interview-like interactions with the media. You'd like to see what have people already asked. Where, if you ask the same questions as everyone else, you will get the same response as everyone else, extremely generic and rehearsed. All right, so once you've done your research, you should more or less know what it is that you want to ask, and here you're going to plan it out. So try and take a creative angle. This is really important because so many well-known people, or if someone is quite familiar with being interviewed, they've already been asked a lot of questions and you want yours to stand out and be different. If you ask a generic question, the likelihood of you getting a generic response is very high. So Sky here says, I try to take the questions that they've been asked before and take them one step further. For example, I've heard you say X, but I didn't really get a sense of why. Could you talk a bit more about that? Question mark. Okay, so that's great advice. It's a good way to build on what other people have already discussed. Maybe you want them to go further into it, and you can then give them an opportunity to do that and to probe. All right. Then here it says, if your show aims to help listeners learn, try to get your guests to give concrete examples, antidotes, tips, and case studies. So that's really important, especially when you're looking at maybe you're interviewing someone because they're extremely successful or anything like that. It's always great to hear their success stories, but also it's great to hear what they've learned from what they've done, what their tips and tricks are, etc. Okay, and then a little subheading here. When you're preparing your probing questions, make sure that you remain flexible. That's really important. Um, if you ask a question and they respond with something very interesting and there's something there for you to go further into, and you decide not to because you're trying to stick to your list of questions, you may miss a great opportunity to have a discussion and to dive deeper into something important. Okay. But it's important to maintain and retain some degree of flexibility and openness during conversation, but also make sure that you are still steering the conversation. All right. All right, moving on to number 4. Have a pre-interview process. This is really important, not just for yourself, but also for your guest. It's nice to just take a moment before you start recording to just sit down and have a discussion with your guest, to reiterate what it is that you guys will be talking about. Maybe there's certain things that they don't want to talk about or can't talk about, and you'd like for them to indicate that beforehand, just in case anything has changed since the last time you spoke to them. It's also great to create an outline for your guest what is going to happen, with things like where will the episode be published, how will it be promoted, whether or not it will be live, and things like that. Okay, so that's really important to include when you have an interview. Then number 5 is keep the conversation moving forward. So 30 minutes might sound like a lot of time, but if you've got a lot of ground to cover, it really isn't, and that is very, very true. Don't waste lots of time going over your guest background and basic information. So it's important to discuss your guest background and their basic information, but unless they're there to be interviewed about a topic that is their autobiography, you really want to skim over that and then move on to the more meatier section of the conversation. Especially for people who are listening to your podcast, if it's someone that we're familiar with, we don't really want to hear the nitty-gritty about their past and their basic information. We want to hear what the topic is for that day. All right, and number 8 is listen back to your own interviews. This is really important. It helps you catch crutch words, which, for example, have been shown here as you know and like. I know myself, I'm quite guilty of like, as in like, etc. I'm guilty of that. So that'll help you to realize that you are using these words and phrases. It also allows you to critique your own work, to check pronunciation, maybe you're speaking too fast or too slow or anything like that. And then number 9 is learn from master interviews. Find an interviewer whose style you like and try to break it down on a more granular level. What's really important here is just because you like someone's style, you should not be imitating them. Okay, that's something that's quite important with podcasts. It is extremely difficult to imitate a successful podcast because you want your podcast to be successful. It still needs to have its own unique style and feel to it. So always be very wary of that. All right, moving into our next part of the lesson, how to start a podcast in less than an hour. All right, so obviously with all the information I've thrown at you guys, it seems like that's unlikely, but it clearly is possible. And we're going to explain to you how it is possible. During the lecture, there are little areas where we say it's an exercise and that you need to execute it. I want to encourage you guys to start doing this in class and then to continue doing so later on. All right. I will inform you guys about the goal activity with regards to this. All right. So gather your tools before you get started. Firstly, as we said earlier, all you really need to start a podcast is hardware and software, which all fit onto your phone. So you can use your phone to record your podcast audio, or a smartphone or computer to edit and mix your audio, and then you can make use of Anchor to host and manage your podcast. Okay, so that's where we're starting, collecting our tools. Then the next step is choose your podcast topic and format. This can take you 10 minutes. All right, so choose a podcast topic that you're passionate about. So it's similar to the interviewing thing. Don't just take it because it's popular or because it's well known. You need to be genuinely passionate about the person you're interviewing or about the topic that you're speaking about. Okay. Next, identify the target audience for your show. We need to look at, are you looking to target younger generations? Are you looking to target males or females, non-binary? Whatever the situation is, who do you predict your audience will be? Who is it that you want this information to communicate with? And then finally, choose a format that matches your topic and audience. Your show's format dictates how you'll engage with your topic. So again, this is where we're going to look at the different types of podcasts, which we went over a little bit earlier. Okay, so here's a little exercise for you guys. It's your turn. So list 3 topics you're passionate about. Write down your ideal audience for each topic. Narrow down a topic and audience you'd like to move forward with, so meaning choose one, and then select a format that matches your topic and your audience. Okay, give you guys a few minutes to do this. All right, now that you guys have done that, let's move on. So now we're going to outline your pilot episode. So your pilot episode is basically your first episode, your trial episode. Okay. This should take you about 10 minutes. So your podcast outline is your roadmap for creating an engaging first episode that sets the tone for what listeners can expect. So here are following segments that you need to keep in mind when you're outlining your pilot episode. So obviously your intro, music, introducing yourself and your show, that's very important. Then we look at music cues. Okay, so there's points in the episode where you can use music to transition between each section. This is going to be included in your intro, your outro, in between, etc. Then your scripted segments. These are the segments of your episode where you have a pre-written script can enhance your listener's experience. So this could be, for example, maybe your intro, maybe your outro. Maybe you want the same intro and same outro for all your episodes, or it's an advertising segment or anything like that. All right. Then you need to plan for your interview segments. Was your interview 20 minutes? Was it 15 minutes? Then ad breaks. That's also very important. With some of the platforms, there is a minimum amount of ads that need to be put into your podcast, and you can then plan around those. All right. And then finally, your outro. These segments appear at the end of your episode, and you can use them to credit your team and shout out your social channels. That's a really nice thing to do, is to start plugging your own social media, your channel social media, etc. All right. Then the next step is to prepare your podcast for launch. This is going to take up to 5 minutes. So this involves sharing all the information that listeners see in their podcast app, including your show's title, description, and cover art. Okay, so your title should be short and catchy. You also want it to be memorable, okay? So here it says 30 characters or less. That is more than enough. 30 characters is more than enough for your title. Your description should also be short and reflect the tone of your show. So we'd like to keep it under 100 words because it should be kind of like an abstract for your show. Kind of like a short summary, introduction kind of thing. And then you're going to include links to your show social handles and websites, okay? That's if it's available. Usually you can just include it in the description. And then please pay attention to the SEO here and include any keywords that are relevant to your show. Okay, so this could be adult content or anything like that. All right, please pay attention to that. Just warn audience before they listen to your stuff. Then your cover art should stand out to prospective listeners. Obviously, you want it to be interesting, but you also want it to relate what it is you're talking about. So make sure that you can relate that, right? All right. Next, it's your turn. Write your title and description in your Anchor account. All right. If you guys don't already have an Anchor account, please go and download it if that is the software that you would like to use. And then create your cover art with Anchor's cover art creator and upload it to your account. It is very easy. As I said earlier, I have actually used this. Super easy. If I can do it, I promise you anyone can do it. All right. Then once we've done that, we're going to move on to the next step, which is publish and share your podcast. This is going to take 5 minutes. So once you've shared your podcast, you make it public, etc., it may take a couple of hours or a few days for your show to appear on every podcast app you choose to distribute it on. Remember, they still need to do checks on it and things like that, all right? And then once your episode or show trailer is live, share it on your social channels and start getting the word out, right? That's very important. Just having created a channel isn't always enough. You also need to push the advertising of it, etc. All right, and that is the end of the lesson. So for our next lesson, we're going to look at students to share their knowledge and do research on the following. The aim will be on peer-to-peer learning. So similar to a lesson that we had the other day, peer-to-peer learning. So you're going to discuss, or at least speak a lot more than I will be in this lesson, hopefully. So you're going to share resources on the following. Great podcasts you've listened to. Why do you like listening to these? And be specific. What is important when planning a podcast? Obviously, this is your opinion. It can also be based on your research and also what we've discussed today. What editing software do you use and what tips can you share? And then which hosting and distribution platforms do you use and what tips and tricks can you share? All right, guys. And that is the lesson. Here are the references that I've used. Please make sure if you're interested in reading further, please go and click on them.